I'm in like the most incredible place on the face of the planet, and I'm using it to make a Dungeon World video. A year ago, I discovered the tabletop role-playing game Dungeon World and decided to make a video about it. My buddy Ronald the Rules Lawyer watched it and was like, dude, this is really good. You should totally share it with the Dungeon World subreddit. I bet they'd really like it. So I did, but little did Ronald or I know, nobody hates Dungeon World more than the Dungeon World community. So why does the internet hate my favorite role-playing game? Well, first, we gotta flip your expectations. So here's a fun fact about your friendly neighborhood tabletop bro. I am like deathly afraid of mountain lions. Now, if you're like me, you're probably expecting the people who shit on Dungeon World the hardest to be D&D hardos. And going into this video, you might be expecting that the biggest criticisms are gonna be like the lack of racial options, the lack of subclasses, or something like that. But the 5e faithful are too busy arguing amongst themselves on how to best hack their dragon game to make it into Pathfinder 2nd edition to even know that Dungeon World exists. Swear to God, one of them's watching me. No, the biggest detractors of the OG fantasy Powered by the Apocalypse game are the Powered by the Apocalypse hardos themselves. And almost all of their grievances come from one core problem. Dungeon World is too much like D&D. I'm squinting because the sun's in my eyes. Now, what does that even mean? Well, for one, hit points equal trash. You can't have a Dungeon World sucks comment without complaining about the health system. Just saw another hiker over there, and I've never been more ecstatic to see another human being in my life. Almost every single Powered by the Apocalypse system has a better way of keeping track of players' damage. Apocalypse World, which is what all Powered by the Apocalypse games are named after, uses a damage clock system where the more damage you receive, the more the clock fills up. And the more the clock fills up, the less able you are to recover from that damage. So if you stub your toe, that's moving it to 1 o'clock. That's easily recoverable. If you get mauled by a fucking mountain lion, that's like a 9 o'clock. It's gonna be really fucking hard to recover from that, and that's why I'm so fucking scared. Now, on the other hand, the regiment uses a combination of a stress system and a wound system to keep track of player damage. So every time you take damage, you have to roll to find out if you take a stress or if you take a wound, and every single wound is attached to a piece of your body. And if you max out your stress, you max out your wounds, then it's game over. By the way, I haven't actually played either of those two systems, so if I totally got that wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments. Anyway, Masks, which is arguably the pinnacle of the Powered by the Apocalypse system, famously uses conditions. Basically, each time your character gets injured, they take a condition which not only affects their stats, but affects how they play in the game. So, for example, if you get mauled by a mountain lion, you mark afraid, and that does a minus that to all of your stats, and you have to roleplay as scared until you clear the condition. Which in my experience, almost none of my players do actually roleplay as the conditions they've marked, but that's because my players suck. And of course, if a player takes all 5 conditions and then has to take another one, they're out. They're out of combat. Not necessarily dead, it just means that their role in this scene is over. Now, all of those examples have one thing in common. Their damage tracking systems roll with the narrative a lot better than the much gamier form of hit points. And staying narrative focused is what Dungeon World and Powered by the Apocalypse is all about. Now for 2, the damage system is trash. Just like how PbtA diehards hate the health system because it's unnecessarily gamey and breaks immersion, they also hate the damage system because it's unnecessarily gamey and breaks immersion. And personally, I think the greatest sin of Dungeon World's combat system is that it uses damage die that aren't D6s. Okay, I don't think anyone actually thinks that. Probably. It's probably a comment on a forum post somewhere. Anyway, I kind of agree with the D-dub's detractors here. As written, dealing a D10 or D8 or D6 in damage just doesn't add the same narrative flair that the damage systems of newer, more polished PbtA systems offer. The GM has to do a lot more legwork to make that numerical damage actually mean something within the narrative. After all, what does 3 points of damage even look like in the fiction? it got hot. In Masks, dealing damage to a villain has actual consequences that affects the narrative. They get conditions that changes the way that they behave. Furthermore, almost all of the moves within Masks are built around the idea of narrative control. These are words and phrases like +1 forward or open up an opportunity for your allies. You know, things that sound kind of dumb to those of us who migrated from D&D or Pathfinder, but really give a lot more narrative control to the players. On the other hand, moves in Dungeon World are built all around just doing more damage. It doesn't really give that much narrative control to the players. In order to get that same experience, you have to have a really good GM who really knows what they're doing and how to run a PbtA game. Now, I don't know about you, but in my experience, moves that deal more damage are a lot more appealing to players who are coming from those more mainstream D20 systems rather than moves that open up narrative control. Like a real-life vlogger right now. For 3, and this one's really kind of stupid in my book, but people really do be out here complaining about this. Ability scores. This is really hurting my arm. Now, I don't think anyone has sworn off my favorite RPG solely for this one thing. It's more like a cherry on top of their grievances. Anyway, almost every single move in Dungeon World relies on the ability score modifiers, aka the little numbers. When you roll for hack and slash, you don't add 18, which would be your strength score, you add +3, which is the matching modifier. So what's the point of having the 18? That's the grievance of a great many of the PbtA faithful who like to shit on Dungeon World in between league matches. To go cat backwards so you can see my face. Now, my buddy Sean, who is like way smarter than me, has a pretty good hypothesis for why ability scores are even a thing. One of the core mechanics of Dungeon World is that when you level up, you can increase one of your ability scores. In its current form, it's not perfect, but it does allow for a gradual progression of your character. So if you start your character's strength at 16, which gives you a +2 modifier, it will take you about 2 levels to increase it to 18, which increases it to a +3 modifier, which feels fair. If you get rid of the scores and just go with the modifiers, then you'd either have to rebalance the entire game to account for players bumping up their modifier every single level, or you would have to introduce new complexity by determining when players can increase their ability modifier. And the whole point of getting rid of ability scores was to make this whole thing less complex. Also, there's a mountain. Now, I'm well aware that Uncommon World actually has a really elegant solution to this, but I didn't make this video for rational solutions, I made it for complaining. Yeah, could I get like 2 McDoubles and a large hazelnut iced coffee? So I think an important thing to understand with all this criticism is that most people don't actually say Dungeon World is necessarily bad. They just say that it's dated. And it's important to realize the context in which the game was created. You see, Dungeon World is like the second powered by the Apocalypse game ever made, only after Apocalypse World, for which the system is named after. Fuck, that's so good. It started development in 2010 and was finally released in 2012, during the height of the D&D 4th edition and Pathfinder 1st edition war. Oh, and by the way, these are far from the only complaints people have with Dungeon World. But where would be the fun if I just dumped all of the things people find wrong with the system in one video? Despite all of these flaws and people poo-pooing it and calling it aged, it's still one of my favorite systems, and I play it all of the time. In fact, I've been playing it a lot more now recently because we have a Discord server that is a West Marches style game. You can click right here, I already pointed there, to see the video going over that a little bit. Thanks for watching.